Hello, viewers, and welcome to the latest installment of the LOTR LCG Progression Series. My name is Mitch, and I am the 10th Nazgul. Joining me, as always, is Matthew, if you'd like to say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we're going to be cracking open our brand new Deluxe Expansion, The Voice of Isengard, and taking a look at 2 new heroes and 13 new player cards. So Matthew, why don't you start us off?
Our first new hero is from the Tactics Sphere, and it's Éomer. He has a threat cost of 10, 1 willpower, 3 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 4 hit points. He has the traits Rohan, Noble, and Warrior, and Response. After a character leaves play, Éomer gets plus 2 attack strength until the end of the round, limit once per round. So, first off, let me say that I love the art. As always, Magali does a bang-up job. The card looks great. With that said, I think we're starting to see what Rohan's going to be all about, whether it's Spirit Rohan or even Tactics Rohan. It's about characters leaving play and that triggering certain sorts of effects. There are certainly a number of Rohan allies that have abilities that allow you to voluntarily or willingly have them leave play. For example, Escort from Aderos would be an ally that could leave play easily, as would the Rittermark's Finest. Certainly, perhaps the best ally would be Westfold Horsebreaker, where if you sent Éomer to the quest for whatever reason, you can discard Westfold Horsebreaker and ready Éomer, and he gets the extra attack boost right off the bat. So certainly, I think there's lots of interesting little synergies between some of the Rohan allies and this particular hero that will be interesting to play around with.
One of the themes of this deluxe expansion is to start to open up that Rohan trait that we really started to see explored once again in the Morgul Vale Adventure Pack. So you mentioned there are a number of when leaves play type effects. We're actually going to be covering a tactics ally from this expansion that's ability centers on it leaving play, and seeing as how we've seen so much development on the spirit side of Rohan up until recently, Éomer, being able to boost himself up to an attack strength of 5, ends up making for a pretty appealing character. Where some of the problem lies, however, since we have still yet to see a ton of Rohan cards, is that, especially looking at some of our other options for Tactics Rohan heroes, we have Theoden and we have Hama, both of which have very high threat costs, and which actually work against some of the Rohan synergy cards that we've seen. So, Spear of the Mark is all about attacking enemies in the staging area, but it's unlikely that you're going to be keeping enemies in the staging area, not only because you're starting with a reasonably high threat, but also because of the variety of different doomed effects that we're going to be seeing introduced on player cards in this expansion. There are cards like 4th Aerlingus, where this is also a little counterintuitive to, and even though in the Black Riders expansion we saw a convenient means of bolstering a non-dwarf, non-elf character's attack strength in the Dagger of Westerness, again, just because your threat values are going to be so high, I think even though Éomer's attacking for 5 is awesome, it might be a little bit difficult to boost it beyond that. So even though you're going to end up having a lot of characters leaving play, Rohan is still probably going to end up being pretty dependent on strength in numbers, as opposed to a lot of stat-bolstering attachments.
This could be a hero that gets better in multiplayer games. Certainly if Theoden's a hero one of your buddies is using, but if there's 3 or 4 players, odds are there's characters leaving play time and time again, whether it's an Untimely Necromancer's Reach or just a chump block or defense. I would wager that in solo it might be more difficult to trigger this effect, or you're going to have to do things like the Westfold Horsebreaker. But on multiplayer, again, you're probably going to have people leaving, so I would wager almost every round he should be getting 5 attack, which, while perhaps difficult to boost, but there are certainly ways to do it, it's going to come in quite handy.
I definitely don't think that characters leaving play are going to be a problem anytime soon. Like we mentioned, Rohan has a number of different effects like that. The more players there are in the game, the more likely someone is to use sneak attack. Maybe even as a tactics player, you're going to be taking advantage of Borne Aloft. I think it's a great idea if you try to compound your benefit from those characters leaving play. So if you have Horn of Gondor to put onto someone, another character I'm really excited about running alongside Éomer is Prince Imrahil. So at the cost of one ally, maybe Éomer not only gets his attack boost, but you can also ready Prince Imrahil. So even though you might not have a tremendous number of allies on the table, Rohan is starting to see a lot of different readying effects. So you might be able to bring the same heroes back again and again, ready them up, and then have them quest a bunch, defend a bunch, or dispatch a multitude of adversaries. As the game continues to progress, we see better and better chump blockers introduced. For example, Squire of the Citadel. So you spend a mere one resource off Imrahil to put that chump blocker into play. Once he dies, you end up getting that resource back, in addition to an attack boost, in addition to a ready hero, maybe a resource from the Horn, all sorts of different effects like that. It could even be a great opportunity to trigger something like Valiant Sacrifice to make sure you always have plenty of cards cycling into your hand, just so you can put down those allies whether or not they leave play. We've also seen spoiled in a number of preview articles that part of the Ringmaker cycle of adventure packs that are going to be following up this deluxe expansion focus around the Sylvan and Noldor, and part of their synergy is going to be all about characters leaving play, which works perfectly in conjunction with a Rohan deck.
Certainly, I think that perhaps Éomer is a prime candidate for Seed of the Mark, the spirit attachment we saw in the Morgul Vale, where after the attached hero commits to a quest, spend one resource to ready that hero. You know, he has the one willpower, which isn't stellar, but you might as well get something out of it. Certainly, if Theoden's on the table, he's questing for 2, which for a tactics hero is quite respectable. But again, I like Seed of the Mark quite a lot because it's just another way to get multiple uses out of your heroes. And so you get to quest with his 1, perhaps 2 willpower, and then if a character leaves play, you're getting to also use his 5 attack strength. So I'm thinking this is a hero that I'm hoping is as fun in reality as he is in theory. Faramir springs to mind, a hero that a lot of us are really excited about, but I think a lot of players have come to sort of think that he's fallen flat in practice. And certainly Éomer could be a hero that's like that, but somehow my gut tells me that he'll be a little bit easier to pull off his response and have him actually work quite well.
Even more than Seed of the Mark, I'm very excited for the new tactics attachment we've yet to cover in this video that's brand new to the Voice of Isengard, and I'm looking forward to running Éomer alongside not only Prince Imrahil, but also possibly Hama, one of our other tactics Rohan heroes, to end up bringing the Eagles back. So Winged Guardian and Vassal of the Windlord both have when they leave play type effects, and if you take advantage of Hama, maybe give him multiple actions through the Steed, through that card we've yet to cover, you can recycle the Eagles are coming, you can put a bunch of disposable allies into play. So just like you set up, certainly Éomer looks good on paper. I think that he's got a hell of a lot of potential. This could make for a very, very fun deck, but since you and I have yet to play any of the Voice of Isengard scenarios, how effective all of these cards are in practice certainly remains to be seen. But in any case, it's great starting to see the Rohan trait get a little bit of love, whereas we've previously seen effects like Astonishing Speed and We Do Not Sleep to make Rohan into very potent questing characters. It's certainly nice to see so much combat prowess added to that trait, and I can't help but be excited about the sheer volume of character readying effects. So, our second hero introduced in the Voice of Isengard is Grima. With a threat cost of 9, he has 2 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, and 3 hit points. He has the traits Rohan, and for the first time, Isengard, and action. Lower the cost of the next card you play from your hand this round by 1. That card gains Doomed 1, and limit once per round. So, Grima is a very interesting character because apart from Gleowine, we haven't actually seen a single lore Rohan ally, hero, event, attachment, anything of the kind. Lore also doesn't really dip into the realm of resource acceleration, but Grima allows you to do that. Particularly of interest are that his stats don't actually add up to match his threat cost, and that ability is going to be escalating your threat value pretty quickly. So, normally it's Spirit's Realm reducing threat, but Grima, and really all of the Doomed cards we're going to be seeing in this expansion, strike me as introducing a very interesting, intriguing payoff, a new form of risk and reward for the players, where maybe they can accelerate their advancement, they can play more aggressively in the early game, but with some definite long-term risk, and the risk of exposing themselves to some pretty nasty encounter effects a lot earlier than they otherwise would.
Yeah, this Dune mechanic will certainly be an interesting one to try out, and I'm certainly interested in attempting to make a Doomed deck. I think the thought that I will have when discussing any effect from this expansion or in the Ringmaker cycle that has the Doomed keyword is you can sort of think of your threat as an extra resource in a sense. In other words, how many games do you actually play where you're consistently ending with 47, 48, 49 threat, or perhaps even threading out at 50. I can say from my own experience over the past 3 years, there aren't that many games that I have played over the years that I'm ending 47, 48, 49, or even 50. I typically lose because of dying or whatever else. So, in a sense, I see Doom being very, very powerful in that since, Mitch, you and I don't care about score, who cares if we end the game at 49 threat? I don't mind using my threat level as an extra source of resource acceleration. So, I'm certainly curious to try it out to see how it works. Certainly there's some quests that rely a lot on encounter card doomed effects or raising your threat where doom cards could be quite risky, but giving doomed 1 to any card in the game could be quite nice. So again, we might say this a lot, and I'll try to limit myself to it, but it's to be determined, I think, the power and the versatility, or even the risk of Doomed. Although, I'll go out on a limb and wager I think it's going to be powerful, perhaps even game-breaking, because again, I'm not ending even starting at 30 or 32 as with a tactics deck. I'm typically not ending quests in the upper 40s. So, I don't know, I'm curious to see it. I don't have much to say about Grima himself. It's nice to have any card you could potentially play have a lower cost, at least a lower resource cost. So I think you're absolutely right that in the early game, I think this ability will shine much more so than in the mid or the late game, because it's really the early game when you're trying to get a foothold over the encounter deck and a stable source of lowering the cost of events or allies or attachments or whatever, while certainly raising your threat, I think will end up being quite a potent effect.
I think my major concern with Grima is just how poorly the Doomed keyword can scale in multiplayer games. So, whereas we're going to end up seeing some really potent card effects that involve Doomed that benefit each and every player, giving one player one resource for potentially every player in the game to have to increase their threat by 1, you're really going to have to take a careful look at the cost-benefit ratio strictly based on the number of characters you're playing, and of course, what's probably more important than anything else is the scenario that you're playing. So if you're expecting to run up against Watcher in the Woods, Grima might not be the best hero choice for you. What I do find kind of captivating about this ability is it works fantastically as a rescue effect, so if it just so happens that you're one resource shy from playing your powerful event or an ally that's going to end up making all the difference, this affects the next card that you play, whereas the only other resource acceleration we've really seen in lore, Master of Lore, specifically affects lore cards and lore cards alone. So this certainly is pretty flexible. I think something really important to keep in mind is the fact that this ability is an action, and you actually have to make sure there's an action window for you to take advantage of it. So if you're going into the quest phase and you know that there's a chance you're going to end up revealing some sort of nasty encounter card, maybe you've got a test of will in hand but you don't have the resources for it, it's of paramount importance that you remember there is no action window during staging, so you can't trigger Grima's ability as a response. You might have to trigger it before you go into staging, just on the off chance that you're going to need that cost reduction in order to play that event. So I certainly think that there are times when players might end up triggering this and not actually get to benefit from it, but I do like that that effect persists until the end of the round and not the end of the phase. So even if you don't get to play your test of will, maybe you end up playing Radagast's Cunning or something else. I think another important thing to point out is that it works for any kind of card, so unlike Master of Lore, the only other real resource acceleration we've seen introduced for the lore sphere, that guy only works for lore cards, whereas Grima works for absolutely anything. So he's got reasonable stats by himself. He's certainly not a very proficient attacker, but he is a reasonable quester. He does have an in-sphere match for a Burning Brand. So he's quite a bit squishier than Denethor. He doesn't have the nice trait match for Gondorian Shield, but I could potentially see Grima doing some defending. And as we're going to be covering in this video, the fact that his ability allows players to trigger the doomed keyword at will, limit once per round of course, ends up making for some pretty powerful synergistic effects with a multitude of other cards we've yet to cover.
So, when Grima was spoiled in a preview article not too long ago, it certainly generated a minor controversy. Some of the really strict thematic players were not pleased that an evil or dark character was made into a hero. I would fall into the camp that I'm glad to see Caleb sort of pushing the boundaries a little bit and giving us different sorts of heroes. And it's reminded me of the old Middle-earth CCG back from the 90s, where you could play as what they called a fallen wizard. So if Gandalf had gone the route of Saruman or any of the other 5 wizards. So it was an interesting way to play that particular game. To me, I have no problem with Grima as a hero. Way back in the early life of this game, there was an article that said the timeline of these adventure packs and deluxe expansions are set in the 17 years between Bilbo's birthday and Frodo leaving the Shire. I don't know when Grima became evil, but either way, I don't know if that timeline still holds or not, but you know, for me, playing this game is just getting to play fun adventures in a Middle-earth setting. So I certainly don't mind having a hero that's not quite a knight in shining armor, so to speak. So I think it's definitely interesting. I think Grima is super thematic in that sense. And I don't mind seeing him as a hero at all. In fact, I wouldn't mind seeing more heroes of this sort of ilk that aren't your sort of typical human or humanoid, right, if it's a dwarf or elf, knight in shining armor type. So I'm looking forward to playing with this one. So on to our leadership cards, the first of which is an ally, Orthanc Guard. He has a cost of 2, 1 willpower, 0 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 2 hit points. He has the Isengard trait, much like Grima, and his response reads, after you raise your threat from the doomed keyword, ready Orthanc Guard. So an interesting character to be sure. I think he could potentially be a decent defender. You could send him to the quest for 1, which really isn't all that much, and then if you use the doomed keyword at any point, you get to ready him and then maybe defend with him. So a natural sort of match for Grima, certainly as you were mentioning earlier, whether or not Grima's in your deck or in a buddy's deck. So certainly not the most flashy of allies, but certainly having extra actions out of your heroes, or in this case allies, is never a bad thing.
Yeah, I think taking a look at his stat line, he is certainly a little bit lackluster. He's very reminiscent of a lot of the Gondor allies we've seen, where alone they're not really anything special, but we've started to see quite a bit of synergy where there are a number of effects that, when it all comes together, they can end up being decent. The problem here is that this doesn't tap into much of that Gondor synergy, so you can't have Leadership Boromir giving him a little bit of an attack boost. You can certainly use 4 Gondor to give him attack if you're running a Swarm-type deck, but he doesn't actually end up getting a defense boost. And if you're questing with him, it's a pretty marginal gain. As a defender, I really don't see a combined total of 4 defense plus hit points surviving a lot of enemy attacks. So it certainly is possible that through Grima, or triggering some other doomed action or response, you could get a lot of uses out of this guy, because there's no limit to the number of times you can ready this character. I don't see him being particularly good at any one thing, so maybe his best use is just as a body on the table. Like we've mentioned before, effects like Faramir and Sword That Was Broken end up working out pretty well. If you're going to be running a tactics leadership type Rohan deck like I mentioned, maybe you've got something like Hail of Stones that you can use, and then ready this character and then do another Hail. I think probably the most intriguing use for this character, and possibly the best use in my opinion, is a very good tail. So particularly in the early game, when maybe you're getting the most benefit out of all your plays, and it's of the utmost importance to establish your presence on the table as quickly as possible, you can lay down 1 or more of these guys, you can exhaust them for a very good tail, you can put more allies into play, you can maybe ready these, maybe even play another very good tail, so certainly there are possibilities with this character, but as printed, he's yet to blow me away. But our second and final leadership card of this deluxe expansion is Legacy of Numenor, an event with a cost of 0, but has Doomed 4. Action: add 1 resource to each hero's resource pool. So, this is certainly an incredible example of how fantastically powerful some of these Doomed cards are going to be in this expansion, but it also demonstrates the immense cost at which they can come. If it just so happens that you find yourself with this card in your hand, even though it doesn't actually cost any resources, and even though it can give every single player in the game a grand total of 3 resources at their disposal, that threat cost is absolutely immense, and depending on your encounter deck, depending on the engagement cost of enemies, it might end up making your situation much worse in the long term, or it might allow you to get all of your different deck combos, deck engines up and running far, far faster than you could otherwise hope to.
I think that this card, interestingly, has the biggest bang in a multiplayer game. You get more out of it the more players there are at the table, but at the same time, the risk is worse when there's more players. So, Doom 4 for 4 players seems like astronomical, whereas gaining 12 resources, or in a Saga expansion, maybe gaining 13, seems like pretty good. So, I don't know. I mean, again, jury is still out. I don't want to say this for every single card, but Doom 4 is the highest doomed effect of all of the cards in this particular expansion. And I'm just not so sure it's worth it. I mean, a lot of these doomed cards in many ways seem like win more cards. Is having 4 threat really worth the 3 resources? Maybe in the early game. Maybe even in the late game or the mid game. I just don't know. I can't, I'm trying to, for a lot of these doomed cards, think in my head to past games I've played where was it absolutely critical for me to have 3 extra resources right then and there, yet still raise my threat by 4? Would that have made things worse? Certainly in some things, like Journey Along the Anduin, I would love to have earlier resources to help me have a better army to deal with the Hill Troll, or maybe even conflict at the Carrick. The problem is, the 4 Doomed is probably going to push me over the top and have an engagement cost higher than 30. So it's certainly a powerful effect. The cost is steep. I think if a buddy was to bust this card out, I would probably give them a look, flip over the table, and we might start all over. So again, I'm really excited to try these cards out and see if the reward is worth the risk. But this one, I think, is the riskiest of them all.
I think it's absolutely fascinating to suddenly have access to a number of different cards like this that don't have a traditional tangible resource cost, but they do cost players one of the very real resources, as it were, in this game, which is their threat total. So oftentimes you're not going to be seeing any kind of detriment to playing a card like this. Maybe you'll be powerful enough where whether or not you have 32 or 36 threat, it doesn't actually end up making any difference at all. So what I'm perhaps most curious about is, now that we've started to see extraordinarily powerful effects like this, we're going to be covering one for each of our different spheres of influence. Is it going to end up trivializing a lot of old quests? Certainly the Doomed 4 is an extraordinarily high cost. We've only seen a single card that trumps that, Disturbed Waters from the Watcher in the Water at Doomed 5. We've only seen a pair of Doomed 3 cards, so it's a huge expense, but it's such an incredible effect. I just cannot wait to see what players come up with. If you're at all interested in the traditional card game aggro style of play, I think you're absolutely going to love Doomed, and I'm very curious to see how it turns out for scenarios where there is a strong likelihood of your raising your threats. Is the added risk of hitting threat 50 worth getting out a number of these powerful effects in the very early game and really speeding up your deck?
I think, Mitch, your point about Doom cards perhaps trivializing earlier quests is spot on. The one that comes to mind for me is Shadow and Flame, where the players start at 0 threat. So that was a great quest back in the day for secrecy cards, because everyone's under the secrecy threshold, in many cases, for the entire life of that particular quest. Now, if your starting threat is 0, why not put every Doom card in the world in your deck? So I think you're right. There's certain quests that Doom cards are just going to be stellar in, whereas others, if there's lots of threat gain effects, they might be less worthwhile. So as we so often say in our card review videos and in our progression series playthrough, doing an encounter deck analysis is often key to winning.
Really, just building off of what you just mentioned, we've seen that throughout the Ringmaker cycle of adventure packs, FFG intends to bring secrecy back, and that's definitely going to be a mechanic that works entirely against all these threat escalation effects. So I'll be curious to see which one ends up being more powerful or more viable in the end. But in a multiplayer environment, I definitely don't see those two deck archetypes working at all together. And if anything, maybe the Ringmaker cycle of adventure packs is going to end up making pickup games more of a pain in the ass than ever before.
My final thought on this one is perhaps the sting would be a little bit less if someone's running Mono Spirit, they get 3 resources, and then could play Galadrim's Greeting on me for 6, because that might, I'd be okay with that. But short of that sort of situation, I think you're right. It'll be interesting to see what happens with pickup games or what have you in the future.
Yeah, I guess in a 4-player game, if 2 people could do the Galadrim's Greeting trick, you entirely negate that Doomed keyword, and you're able to benefit from all sorts of other effects, be it Thank Guard or any of the ones we're about to mention. Really the only kind of cute combo I could think of for Legacy of Numenor was the Lore Ally Harbor Master, who actually ends up getting a defense boost after a card effect adds resources to a hero's resource pool, so it would immediately jump from 0 defense to 3, for each copy of this card you play, depending on how ballsy you're willing to be. So, still not thrilled to put Harbor Master into a deck, but certainly a potent combination.
Up next are our tactics cards, the first of which is a 2-cost ally, Westfold Outrider. 0 willpower, 2 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 2 hit points. He is both Rohan and a scout. And action. Discard Westfold Outrider to choose an enemy not engaged with you. Engage the chosen enemy. So, Mitch, this is one of the allies I think you were alluding to earlier for Éomer. Certainly, you can willingly discard him like so many of the other Rohan allies, and Éomer's going to get that extra attack boost. What's sort of sad is you're paying 2 for 2 attack strength, and I would normally want to keep that on the table. But the action could certainly be worthwhile if there's a goblin sniper in the staging area, for example. That enemy is so annoying. This is a way to pull him down if you couldn't otherwise do so. And then, again, you get the boost for Éomer. So, nice ally, fun, action-y art. I really like him. I just think he's the perfect complement for a Prince Imrahil or Éomer type of deck.
I do like this character. I think he serves an interesting, a little bit niche purpose. Since you happen to mention the Goblin Sniper from Journey Along the Anduin, back in the day, one of the only reasons players would consider running our Leadership Core ally Son of Arnor at a cost of 3 was to drag that enemy down out of the staging area. So, certainly having that Rohan trait gives him far better synergy than a Dunedain character could hope to access. And considering he's tactics, if you're splashing Spirit, if there's a different player running Spirit that has access to all that wonderful questing Rohan synergy, even though he doesn't have any base willpower, he can end up making a pretty decent contribution. Like you mentioned, 2 resources for 2 attack is a pretty reasonable investment. His ability works great in emergency situations, and unlike Son of Arnor, even though you have to discard him, you can trigger it at any time, so not only is he a little bit cheaper, but it's not only when he enters play. What I particularly like about this ability is since there's an action window between staging and quest resolution, if you're maybe playing that Mono Tactics Rohan deck, you're still probably going to be struggling from time to time to make enough threat to overcome what the encounter deck dumps onto the table. So, if it just so happens you revealed some nasty high-threat enemy, maybe dragging it out of the staging area is going to end up making the difference between exploring a location or completing a quest card. Maybe you're going to save yourself having to increase your threat and all the other players' threats, particularly given the context that there might be all of these doomed keywords triggering. Certainly, it might not be the most common play, but it's certainly possible for players to trigger this action and then put Farmer Maggot from the Black Riders into play, just to deal some damage directly to an enemy now engaged with them. And probably the most obvious use for this character is, if there's another player on the board that's overwhelmed, if you're running that Mono Tactics Rohan deck, you don't have access to Baragond, you might not have a bunch of Sentinel characters, this might end up being a decent means for you to rescue that player.
Yeah, what I also think is nice is that you don't have to exhaust him as part of the cost to trigger his action. So you might actually get to use his 2 attack strength in attacking an enemy, then discard him. Éomer's got 5 and can attack a different enemy. So I think there's lots of uses for this particular ally, and he's really going to shine in a Tactics Rohan deck.
Sure, I mean, in a multiplayer game, if you don't have keywords like ranged, depending on who the first player is, maybe you have an enemy engaged with you, you attack and damage that enemy, maybe you're triggering an effect like Rivendell Blade to drop that enemy's defense, and then maybe I end up using Westfold Outrider, drag that enemy over to my side of the table, and finish it off. So, there's countless possibilities for this card, there's so much Rohan synergy we're starting to see, there's so many card effects to trigger when characters leave play, whether he's chump blocking or whether it's making use of his abilities, so definitely looking forward to trying out this ally. So our second tactics card is an attachment. It's the 1-cost Rohan Warhorse. It is trait Mount and reads attached to a tactics or Rohan hero, restricted. Response: after attached hero participates in an attack that destroys an enemy, exhaust Rohan Warhorse to ready attached hero. So this attachment immediately brings to mind probably one of the most powerful cards in the game, which is Unexpected Courage, which at no cost whatsoever allows you to ready the attached hero round after round after round. And even though this is a restricted card, it is cheaper than Unexpected Courage, and it's in the tactics sphere. So I love the fact that you're not limited to strictly putting this on Rohan characters, and if you're running tactics, what you're doing is killing enemies. That's what you'd be using something like Unexpected Courage for in the first place. So certainly, whomever you're intending to attack with, bolster up their attack strength, put one or more copies of Rohan Warhorse on them, and just go to town.
Yeah, this is a fantastic, fantastic card. In a way, it's sort of weird that all the mounts aren't limit 1 per character. Seems a little bit weird to me to be riding a Rohan Warhorse and a State of the Mark at the same time, but with that said, it's great. There's a host of tactics heroes that this would be fantastic on. Legolas from the core set, of course, comes to mind. If he can attack multiple times, you're generating more and more progress. Even Merry from the Black Riders, because if he participates in an attack with someone else, he can ready a hero, you can ready him again, he attacks again, you ready another hero. Just a great, great card that I'm sure will become a staple for almost every tactics deck.
You definitely want to use some means of bolstering up that character's attack strength, or just having multiple characters ready so that you can guarantee you're actually killing enemies, but this card just strikes me as so immensely powerful. Merry, like you mentioned, is a perfect example. Maybe you can trigger an unseen strike, and then Merry can kill something, ready another character, kill something else, ready another character. The possibilities with this card just seem absolutely limitless, and like I mentioned with Unexpected Courage, something like this actually frees up the other player to stick that attachment on other heroes. So the sheer number of readying effects we're starting to see is practically dizzying. Apart from Theodred and Dune here, we haven't really seen any Rohan heroes that are worth repeatedly attacking with, but if you've got a Dune here deck, this allows him a fantastic opportunity to commit multiple attacks into the staging area. The only problem in that context is that's when I really feel as though that restricted keyword might end up being quite the limitation. So, with Legolas, it takes up a Rivendell Blade slot. With Merry, it takes up a Blade of Westerness slot. As it does with Dune here as well. So maybe players are going to find themselves a little bit more reliant on traditional effects of raising attack power like Dunedain Mark and For Gondor, cards like that, but I just can't help but feel like this is an immensely powerful card. It doesn't even specify printed tactics heroes, so if you want to put a Song of Battle on your lore hero Faramir, that's certainly an option. So this card has incredible potential, and I'm sure we're going to be playing this as soon as possible.
Our final tactics card is an event, the Wizard's Voice. It has a cost of 0, and it is a spell, Doomed 3. Action. Each player chooses one enemy engaged with him until the end of the phase. Each chosen enemy cannot attack the player that chose it. So basically, this is a multiplayer version of Feint. While Feint only costs 1, it only affects one player in the game. This costs 0, each player raises their threat by 3, and every player gets to choose one enemy to not attack them during the attack phase. So certainly a potentially potent effect. However, I'm not sure it's one that's worth it. You know, I really want to like this card, but I'm not so sure that I do. In a lot of my multiplayer games, whether it's 3 or 4 player, or even sometimes 2, there's really 1 or 2 players that are taking the bulk of the enemies. In other words, in the 3 and 4 player games I've played, a lot with the Grey Company, not all of us have enemies engaged with us. So if all 4 of us did, I could see this being quite helpful. But is it that helpful at the cost of Doom 3? I'd rather probably just play Sentinel Defenders that could probably deal with it. So again, as so many of these Doom cards, I see the power of it, but I'm just not so sure this is one I'd want to include in my decks very, very often.
The theme that the developers have set up for all of these different Doomed events is that they benefit every player, and whereas with the Legacy of Numenor, I'm never going to find myself scoffing at extra resources, for a very hefty threat increase, I think there's a pretty significant likelihood I might not have an enemy engaged with me. So, certainly it's possible that the tactics player might not have a feint in hand, maybe they want more copies of feint-esque effects in their deck, and it might just so happen that they find themselves without any available resources and needing to dodge some enemy attacks. But whatever the reason happens to be, I just don't see this card as having a lot of intrinsic value associated with it, or at least the opportunities in which players would get the most benefit out of it are going to be very few and far between. One of the biggest weaknesses of tactics as a whole is resource acceleration, which this card compensates for, but on the flip side, that big threat increase makes one of Tactics' other weaknesses even worse, so it puts them at even less of a threat advantage against the encounter deck. There are some interesting possibilities with this card, but then you start to add even more risk, or to decrease the overall value. For example, if there are 2 enemies in the staging area, they're both going to engage us, I could optionally engage one, do engagement checks to engage the other, and only benefit from nullifying the attack through this card of one of those enemies, or maybe we could each choose one, I could nullify both of their attacks, and then later on that round, or at some other point when it's convenient, I could discard Westfold Outrider to shift that one enemy back across the table if I don't have a Sentinel Defender, or if it just so happens to work out. I think it's possible that this might provide a little bit of a push for players to move away from a powerful defending character like Baragond, just because if there's some big nastiness in the encounter deck that you have to deal with, but you're only expecting to stomach 1 or 2 attacks, maybe it's possible that you can run 2 or 3 offensive heroes, as opposed to having one dedicated, very high defense character. So, this is a curious card. It strikes me as pretty weak. At least my initial impressions aren't too favorable, so there might be situations where this ends up being pretty handy, whether each player has a big troll engaged with them or a nasty Nazgul engaged with them. So, at least for me, I don't think I'm going to be putting this in decks anytime soon, but certainly, if you can think of some clever, creative, powerful uses, feel free to set me straight. So, on to our spirit cards, the first of which is an ally with a cost of 1, the Westfold Horse Breeder, with 1 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, 1 hit point, and the Rohan trait. And response: after Westfold Horse Breeder enters play, search the top 10 cards of your deck for a mount attachment and add it to your hand, then shuffle your deck. And, whereas I didn't have a very good initial reaction to our tactics event, from the very beginning I've absolutely loved the Westfold Horse Breeder. We've started to see some incredibly powerful mount attachments, we've got our Rohan Warhorse, we've got Asphalloth, and we've got Steed of the Mark, which is probably my least favorite, but it's still respectable, it still gives you bonus actions, and considering that this response allows you to search the top 10 cards of your deck, I think it's pretty realistic that you're going to end up hitting.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. I think it's a great card. All of the mounts, I think, are powerful. I wouldn't be disappointed in any of them. I suppose the worst case scenario is you find all three, if you happen to have all three in your deck, and then you've got to pick one, but that could actually be a good thing, too. So it's a great card. I think if you're going to be using any of the mounts in a multi-sphere deck, the Westfold Horse Breeder is almost an auto-include. She certainly can serve as a chump blocker, or just be committing 1 willpower to the quest. And if she does die, she happens to give Eomer an extra boost. So, I think it's just a great card.
It might not seem like a lot on first glance, but I think this is a fantastically powerful card, especially in the context of a Spirit Tactics deck, which Matthew so often runs in our series. So you mentioned it's a great chump blocker, but it also has a pretty awesome willpower value associated with it. So 1 cost for 1 willpower is pretty good when oftentimes we're investing 2 resources for 2 willpower and considering that a bargain. I love that it's got that Rohan trait, so if you're able to play powerful synergistic cards, you can easily boost up that willpower value to something tremendous. Astonishing Speed turns this 1-cost ally into a quester for 3. If you've got effects in your deck like the Imladris Stargazer, if you're not happy with the top 5 cards, maybe you can play or rearrange so that you can soon play a Westfold Horse Breeder, because if nothing else, that ability shuffles your deck for you. So I think this is certainly only going to get better in time. It's going to add questing power to a Tactics Spirit deck. It's going to help us retrieve all of these awesome mount cards. Rohan is only going to get more and more synergy, so I really can't say enough good things about this ally. It's even another body on the table, so if it just so happens that you're triggering Faramir, 2 copies of this have even more value than a traditional 2 resources for 2 willpower characters. So Westfold Horse Breeder is great, and I cannot wait to see it in action.
Up next is our Spirit Attachment, Silver Lamp. It has a cost of 2, it is an item, and it must attach to a Spirit Hero. While attached hero is ready, shadow cards dealt to enemies engaged with you are dealt face up. Shadow card effects are still resolved when resolving enemy attacks. So interestingly, it doesn't say attached to a printed Spirit Hero, like so many other attachments have been saying lately, so you could certainly use many of the effects in the game to give heroes a spirit icon, and this would work on them. This is perhaps the most powerful card in the set, or at least it's a contender. Revealing encounter cards and revealing shadow effects are the 2 sort of most tense and, in most cases, unpredictable aspects of the game. And in many ways, it's what makes the game so fun, because you don't know what the enemy is going to throw at you. So in that sense, I really don't like this card, because I think it takes a little mystery, a little suspense, a little tension out of the game. With that said, I absolutely can't dispute the power of it. I think it should perhaps be restricted, given the power. It is nice that it only affects you. It doesn't affect all shadow cards on the table. I think, sadly, it relegates Dark Knowledge, which was a lore card, certainly, to the binder, which was you could exhaust Dark Knowledge to look at 1 shadow card that was just dealt to you. So maybe in a lore deck or something, Dark Knowledge would still be worthwhile. But clearly, Silver Lamp is the superior option if you have a hero with a spirit icon. So, I see it being an auto-include in any deck that is going to have a spirit hero from here on out. It's just that powerful.
One of the things that makes this card most powerful, in my opinion, is that even though it's not the first time we've seen some powerful shadow nullifying effect, the perfect example is a Burning Brand, which you have to attach to a lore hero, and it automatically cancels any and all shadow effects dealt to enemies that the attached hero engages against. This allows spirit players a new means of looking at shadow effects, so in some scenarios you might not even need to include Hasty Stroke in your deck anymore if you know exactly which characters need to defend against which enemies. There are certainly scenarios like the Siege of Caer Andros where we have branching shadow effects, where just because you play with a shadow card face up, it doesn't mean that there's all unpredictability thrown out the window, and the same thing goes with additional attacks, like Smog in the Battle for Lake Town. There are a number of cards that end up giving him extra attacks, so in a case like that, you certainly probably want to save some means of outright shadow cancellation. But like I mentioned for our ally we just covered, I think oftentimes one player is going to be running Spirit and Tactics, and neither of those spheres have access to any healing. So if you know, for the most part, exactly what to predict, you can end up defending in a very, very favorable way. Maybe if you're even running something like Orthanc Guardian, where it's pretty squishy, and even though you can potentially get multiple defenses out of it, depending on when you trigger your doomed effect, under normal circumstances, its likelihood of being killed is pretty strong, but with an effect like Silver Lamp on the table, it suddenly becomes so much easier to deal with nearly every shadow effect. There certainly is that small limitation built into it where the attached hero has to be ready, so it certainly would be wise to take advantage of some readying effect, be it Steed of the Mark or Unexpected Courage, but all in all, this is a pretty reasonable cost for an incredibly powerful effect, and I just see this making a huge difference in how players approach deck building and playing the game.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely worthwhile that you noted the hero has to be ready, and so many spirit heroes we want to be questing with. On the other side, a spirit deck, certainly a mono spirit deck, isn't taking a whole lot of enemies, so while this card seems potentially powerful, perhaps it won't be as powerful in actuality. Of course, to me, I'm thinking Owen would be a great recipient of this, because he becomes sort of a tactics hero in a way, and if he's paired with two other tactics people, that would be fantastic. But yeah, in a multiplayer game, I'm not so sure how often a mono spirit deck will be taking the enemies, certainly if there's tactics players on the board, but again, with Sentinel and these sorts of things, the player with a spirit hero that has Silver Lamp attached can certainly feel free to take the enemies, and Baragond or whomever can defend, and the ranged characters can kill it. So while it might not benefit the spirit player engaged with the enemy directly, it allows other players who may participate in the defending or the attacking to really benefit from a card they couldn't otherwise benefit from.
While I definitely agree that it might not always be that the spirit player is well suited to stomach a large number of incoming enemy attacks, certainly it's possible that they might be running effects like Desperate Alliance to donate a spirit hero to the other character, just because if the tactics player has a big horde of goblins engaged with them, like they might see in Dungeons Deep and Caverns Dim, we've got a Nightmare version due out of that quest shortly, that might be absolutely instrumental in making sure that heroes don't die, whether it's to undefended attacks or you can maximize the number of allies that survive and minimize the amount of damage that actually goes on to your heroes. Really, the last thing I have to say about this card is so often throughout our series. Recently, for Caldera and Fatty Bolger, I've complained about 2 defense, 3 hit point spirit heroes that are expected to do a reasonable bit of defending, but it's a fairly dangerous prospect, so knowing exactly what shadow cards are coming up, you can pretty much guarantee that they're not going to meet some sort of sudden, unexpected, untimely end.
One card that combos quite nicely with Silver Lamp is the Spirit Event Small Target from the Encountered Amon Din adventure pack. Basically there, you choose another enemy engaged with you, reveal this shadow card. If it doesn't have a shadow effect, the enemy's attack attacks another enemy. So, with Silver Lamp, where you can see the shadow effects, you can smartly choose enemies to be the targets of small targets. So, I think that card might see some renewed use given Silver Lamp, and it'll be quite fun.
So to round out our spirit cards, last up is an event with a cost of 0, Power of Orthanc, which has the trait Spell. It is doomed to, and action, each player may choose and discard a condition attachment from play. So, previously, the only means we had seen of removing a condition attachment from play was the Miner of the Iron Hills, a 2-cost lore ally. We've certainly had a unique lore ally spoiled in our second Lord of the Rings Saga expansion that's also going to serve that purpose, but for the first time, this is an outside of lore means of getting rid of those nasty condition attachments, whether it's local trouble boosting up your threat, or caught in a web, which can seriously tie up a hero's number of available resources.
No pun intended here, but this to me is the most conditional of the doomed cards. Various LOTR LCG card search websites have pulled up different numbers of condition attachments, so I'm going to say there's approximately 15 treacheries or various other encounter cards that turn into a condition attachment, not counting the Signs of Gollum, because you would probably never want to remove that. With that said, again, doomed affects all players in the game, and I'm not sure I want to raise my threat by 2 to remove someone else's condition attachment. Unless we all happen to have them, but I haven't played that many games where multiple players have condition attachments attached to a hero. So, do I appreciate yet another way to remove condition attachments? Absolutely. This is definitely a card that you're only going to include in your deck, or should only include in your deck, if you know there are condition attachments in the encounter deck, or perhaps multiple or many condition attachments. So, condition attachments are certainly some of the most annoying treacheries or other encounter card effects in the game. I like having another way to remove them. Whether or not I want to pay 2 for one player, maybe 2 players who has it, I'm not so sure. It's definitely a reactive card. There's a lot of quests where this would just be dead on arrival, but if you're playing a quest and you want a way to deal with these conditions and don't want to use the lore allies, well then I guess this is your only option.
This is definitely a card that requires a little bit of scenario analysis. If you're not intending to go up against any condition attachments, then certainly this isn't something worth including in your deck. Like you mentioned, even though there are quite a few different condition attachments, normally we don't see a lot of copies of them in the encounter deck. So for Caught in a Web, I think there are only something like 2 copies, for example. I do appreciate that unlike the Wizard's Voice, this isn't each player chooses one of their heroes or characters or anything like that. It's basically each hero anywhere on the table picks a condition attachment and gets rid of it. So I like that it does have that flexibility. I do like that in a lot of ways this frees up a test of will from being used specifically to counter and prevent those nasty condition attachments. So this is a reasonable card, but it's pretty corner case. It's awfully situational. I don't really see myself using this very often, but in certain quests, this will be an absolute lifesaver. Even if players happen to be running lore, without someone like Dane Ironfoot on the table, that Miner of the Iron Hills really isn't doing much, so this has a small threat value associated with it, but there's no resource investment, so this is an okay card. I definitely see uses for it. I'm not thrilled about it, but I'll take it.
So moving on to our lore cards, the first of which is the ally Isengard Messenger. He costs 2. He has 1 willpower, 0 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 2 hit points. He has the trait Isengard, and his response reads, after you raise your threat from the doomed keyword, Isengard Messenger gets +1 willpower until the end of the round, limit twice per round. So much like the Orthanc Guard, this ally gets a benefit when the doomed keyword is used. Interestingly, it's an increased willpower, which normally we only see in the Spirit Sphere, but now lore gets a little bit of extra willpower boosting. Interestingly, this could work whether it's a doomed keyword on a player card or a doomed keyword on an encounter card, so it makes him, I think, even more versatile. So Since Grima is from the lore sphere, I think the Isengard Messenger is a natural match for Grima's ability and would probably be a nice fit into any deck that's running Grima as a hero.
This is a very interesting character. He's got a cost of 2 for a pretty much dedicated quester, but he only starts off with 1 base willpower. Certainly Grima is a convenient, always available means of triggering that doomed keyword, boosting up your willpower, so the more of these you have on the table at the same time, the more value you start to see out of triggering the doomed keyword. And considering that this character can get up to 3 willpower, it starts to make it relatively appealing. A couple things I like about this character are that his ability persists until the end of the round. So maybe you trigger 1 doomed keyword during your planning phase when you're playing cards, and then you end up triggering it again prior to quest resolution after staging, just to ensure that you have the desired willpower value to accomplish whatever it is you've set out to do. Complete the current quest card, defeat the active location, or break even with the threat value of cards off the top of the encounter deck. I think, again, like with the Orthanc Guard, it's really a shame we don't see anything building on the Isengard trait yet, and certainly relying on triggering that doomed keyword frequently, round after round, can potentially make for some pretty significant threat gains. So this certainly goes very well alongside conventional means of threat reduction. But I'm just really not sure what to make of this character. I think if you are expecting to increase your threat by any sort of appreciable amount, certainly take advantage of things like ranger spikes that already exist within the lore sphere, so maybe some medium to low engagement cost enemy, instead of engaging with you, ends up getting pinned. But I am just curious to see if this guy is going to be at all worth it. The 3 willpower possibility on a lore character is pretty tempting, but considering just how powerful some of the willpower bolstering effects are for Spirit, considering just how rarely both you and myself actually use lore heroes and lore cards, I'm just not convinced that the Isengard Messenger has a place in my deck yet. Paying anything more than Grima's 1 threat for, at most, a handful of willpower seems like a relatively steep investment, so certainly if there are doomed cards that you're going to be playing anyways, he might be worth including in a deck, but I'm just not blown away by this ally. But our final lore card introduced in this expansion is Deep Knowledge, an event for a cost of 0 with Doomed 2, and it reads quite simply, Action. Each player draws 2 cards. So, this was one of the very first Doomed player cards we had spoiled. I'm personally of the opinion that this is probably the most powerful, as Doomed 2, at least to me, does not seem like any sort of significant cost, and so often 2 cards is going to provide the characters a wealth of options and opportunities that throughout the course of a game just end up being absolutely invaluable. So often playing tactics and leadership, there might be games that go by where we don't end up drawing so much as a single additional card, or maybe we don't draw Ancient Matham, maybe a location never comes up, or it just so happens that it never triggers. However you play it, this just strikes me as an immensely powerful effect.
Yeah, I don't have much to say, except that this is my favorite of the Doomed cards, and I don't mind paying 2 threat to draw 2 cards.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a couple allies that benefit from triggering Doomed. What I really like about this card is that in between staging and quest resolution, maybe you're playing this card specifically to dig through your deck for something like Radagast's Cunning or Secret Paths to reduce the amount of threat in the staging area. Or maybe you're digging for something that's going to keep enemies locked in the staging area so you don't have to deal with them that round. Something like Advance warning. So I love that there's no limit to the number of times that you can play this card. Even if you're running mono lore and have access to Mithrandir's advice, that's normally 3 cards for 1 resource at its best, and this is 2 cards for 0, so I see this being incredible, especially if you start the game with this in your opening hand, so I don't have enough good things to say about this. I think it's absolutely incredible, and this is certainly one of the cards that makes me question, are these cards too strong, and are they going to end up trivializing the difficulty of a lot of classic scenarios?
So on to our neutral cards, of which there are 3. The first is the ally version of Saruman. He costs 3 willpower, 5 attack strength, 4 defense strength, 4 hit points. He's both an Astari and Isengard. He's also doomed 3. At the end of the round, discard Saruman from play. Response: after Saruman enters play, choose a non-unique enemy or location in the staging area. While Saruman is in play, the chosen enemy or location is considered to be out of play. So, a slightly higher cost than Gandalf if you consider the 3 doomed and 3 resources for a total of 6, but the same statistical allotment, just moved around a little bit. I'm not sure what to think of him, to be honest. I certainly would prefer Gandalf, I think, in almost any situation, because Saruman to me seems a little bit more niche. Yes, you can remove a non-unique enemy or location. Certainly in some of the Nightmare decks, there's locations with 10 threat that I would love to remove, even if it is only for a turn. He's a prime candidate for sneak attack, of course, because, if something really bad comes out during staging, this is a way to deal with it, or at least delay it for a turn. I just don't know if every player on the table is going to want to raise their threat by 3 in most circumstances, simply to remove a non-unique enemy or a non-unique location. So for me, I don't see Saruman fitting into a generic sort of deck, but I suppose he could find a home in certain decks.
His ability to me strikes me as certainly the most unique and interesting part of the card, in that once he enters play, you have to already have something sitting in the staging area. So if it's an enemy engaged with you, you're out of luck. Or if it's your active location, you're also out of luck. And normally, the most difficult things to deal with in any given scenario are going to be unique. So I don't see myself benefiting from his response very much. Certainly, as he's an Istari, keep in mind that you refresh all your cards, then you have an action window, and then you would discard Saruman from play. So if you've got lore, you could certainly take advantage of Word of Command, or if you're running leadership, you could exhaust him to help pay for a very good tale. But at least for me, I think his best use is going to be probably in a solo environment if you're playing a deck that doesn't have a lot of combat prowess normally, just because that attacking for 5 is very, very significant. I used to run a deck back in the day that was Frodo, the lore version of Aragorn, and Glorfindel, the spirit version. So I didn't have access to Rivendell Blade. I couldn't really do too much when it came to dispatching some big, nasty Witch-King or some similarly formidable adversary. So I think as a game finisher, Saruman could be instrumental. Certainly, I think if you're running either version of Gandalf, he could be a fantastic means of supplementing that. So, if you've saved up enough resources, or you're using the Hobbit Overhill and Underhill version of Gandalf, and you don't mind the pretty colossal threat gain, again, that was a deck that had the lore version of Aragorn in it, that's a grand total of 9 attack power on top of maybe using Gandalf's 4 damage ability. So, Saruman is certainly interesting. I'm not overwhelmed by his ability, but certainly his stats are respectable. If you absolutely have to quest, the willpower's pretty decent. I kinda see the 4 threat and 4 defense as basically being a waste, but at least if you're using him in a defensive capacity, you can guarantee that whatever enemy or location you picked doesn't re-interplay partway through the combat phase. So all in all, this is an interesting character. It's certainly got some situational uses, it certainly has some strong possibilities, but by no means do I feel that this is a contender for inclusion in any deck, and I don't think he's going to be giving the likes of Gandalf a run for his money anytime soon. So, on to our second neutral card. It's the unique neutral attachment Keys of Orthanc. With a cost of 1, has the trait item attached to a hero and response. After you raise your threat from the doomed keyword, exhaust Keys of Orthanc to add 1 resource to attached hero's resource pool. So, it seems like a fairly simple, straightforward effect to me. We've seen a variety of different doomed effects. It's likely that they're going to be triggering with relative frequency, so this is unique. Up to a maximum of 1 time per round, you can essentially gain a resource in addition to what other effects you're seeing.
Yeah, of course, Grima is a prime target for this effect. And again, it will trigger whether it's a player card with the Doom keyword or an encounter card, so again, it makes this card a little bit more versatile. I think if you're going to attempt to make a doomed deck, that this is obviously an auto-include, I think, in almost every situation. It's a great card. In a way, it's sort of weird, because the Doom keyword offsets the cost, and so are you really needing resources if you're paying for a bunch of Doom stuff? But there's a lot of non-Doom cards that I suppose the resources could be worthwhile for, so I think it's a great card.
I think just like the doomed keyword itself, you really see the most benefit in a single-player environment, so especially considering that this is unique, it's not as if every player can benefit from this effect, so if you're just one player, you can certainly use this probably every round. I think this makes Grima even better, like you mentioned, in giving lore a potentially fantastic means of resource acceleration, but this also works perfectly well with a host of different resource-dependent attachments and events that we saw throughout the Against the Shadows cycle, like Gondorian Fire, where a hero gains attack strength equal to its attached number of resources, Blood of Numenor, which is the same for defense, and then the spirit event, Lay of Nimrodel, which boosts willpower based on the number of resources you have. So, until we see enough doomed cards where you can be running a 50-card, zero-cost, all-doomed deck, I think this is certainly going to be valuable. I just think it's a damn shame that it's unique, so certainly, if you're using Doomed, this seems to me like an auto-include. If you're running up against an encounter deck that has a ton of Doomed cards, this is also an auto-include. So, it's not the craziest ability, but it makes sense, and I'm sure it'll find a place in countless decks.
So our final player card of this deluxe expansion is the neutral zero-cost event, the Seeing Stone. It has Doomed 1 and action. Search your deck for a card with the Doomed keyword and add it to your hand. Shuffle your deck. So again, I think it's a great card. Certainly would be nice for Keys of Orthanc. And if you absolutely need one of those Doom cards, many of which are sort of reactionary, getting rid of a condition attachment, for example, or needing a feint for multiple players on the table, this is one way to fetch it. Of course, it raises the cost because it's just an added threat increase of 1 for this card itself, and then whatever the other Doomed card happens to be. But again, if you're running Doomed, this is a way to ensure that you have the Doomed card that you need when you need it. I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, there's really not too much to say about this one. It's a little bit of a tutoring effect, so I'm curious to see if players are going to be running a lot of Doomed cards from different spheres. Certainly the variety that we have to pick from each sphere is a little lacking at the moment. We just have one event per sphere that has the Doomed keyword associated with it, so at first it might seem a little bit silly using this card just to fetch your deck for a copy of the Wizard's Voice or something like that, but it certainly thins your deck a little bit, it increases the likelihood of your getting those cards, and certainly as we see more and more Doomed cards come out, this only stands to get better over time. As with all of our doomed cards, the fact that it costs 0 is extremely handy, considering that it's neutral, it's next to free to play. You're able to trigger effects like Isengard Messenger or the Orthanc Guard, so that you can subsequently use those allies to quest harder, or trigger effects like a very good tail, so this basically functions like a wild card. Really, the only other thing I can think of to say is that if you're running Imladris Stargazer, this is another means of shuffling your deck, so it's a decent card. It certainly isn't anything thrilling, but in this game, it's really only a handful of effects that allow you to search your deck specifically for something, and there's just no way that that's not going to be a useful effect.
Right. I think what's perhaps the nicest thing about it is that it can be used at any time. So, for example, if you really want that extra willpower out of the Isengard Messenger, or if you really want to ready the Orthanc Guard, a lot of the other Doomed cards are situational. A condition attachment, or again, the sort of multiplayer feint that you wouldn't be playing during the questing phase, for example, or perhaps when you need or want the Orthanc Guard to be ready. So you can play this at any time to pull back whichever cards you happen to need. You could even pull back Saruman, he's got the Doomed keyword, to trigger those other effects on the allies. So yeah, again, I think you're right. There aren't a whole lot of cards to search for something particular. It's usually search the top 5 or top 10. So I think it's quite nice. I think it's the most versatile way to trigger the allies that combo with Doomed. And so again, I think it's an auto-include in any Doomed deck.
Well, now that we've covered our 2 new heroes and 13 new player cards of the Voice of Isengard Deluxe Expansion, Matthew, what are your overall thoughts on these latest additions to our card pool?
Well, I'll start by saying there was a catalog advertisement from before I believe the game even came out that showed various player cards and encounter cards, and one of the player cards from that advertisement years ago had the Doomed keyword. So this has been something they've been thinking about for player cards since before the game even came out. And here we are, 3-4 years later, and we're finally seeing it on player cards. With that said, my thoughts on the expansion itself, I certainly like Eomer. To me, he's probably one of the most exciting cards in the set. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Silver Lamp is potentially very powerful. And of the Doomed cards, my favorite is Deep Knowledge. I think that can find a place in any deck, whether you're trying to build upon the Doomed keyword or not. With that said, I'm not so sure I'm yet willing to try a Doomed deck. I certainly want to see one in action, but whether or not I will build one is another story. I think I probably will try it out at some point. As with so many deluxe expansions, when they're introducing all of sort of the new keywords or the new traits or the new themes for the cycle, it's hard to know where things will go or how powerful it will end up. So I guess I could say I'm cautiously excited about this particular expansion. So many of the cards do revolve around Doomed, so if you're not interested in making a Doomed deck, then a lot of these cards are going to be probably just not your style. There's a little bit of Rohan stuff here, not a ton. Certainly I'll be making a Rohan deck to play this weekend, and I'm excited to try out all of those cards. So yeah, I think it's a pretty solid entry into our card pool, and I'm really curious to see at the end of the cycle how everything plays out.
I certainly think that we're at least a little ways away from being able to create powerful Doomed-specific decks, just because outside of those 3 neutral cards, we really only do have one, often situational, Doomed keyword event for each of our different spheres of influence. I think certainly Deep Knowledge is probably my favorite of all of these different effects, allowing every player to draw cards for a pretty marginal threat cost, but I also can't help but look toward Legacy of Numenor as a potentially very powerful, albeit costly in threat effect, just because that early game in particular, resource acceleration can be immense, and the faster we can get our decks up and running, the faster we can get combos and synergy rolling, the more likely we are to just absolutely smash the encounter deck. So, personally, I think I'm much more interested in some of the Rohan cards that we've introduced. Certainly, I'm wondering what we'll see in regard to lore Rohan cards, apart from Grima, but I think Éomer is fantastic, and really, for the first time, it has me interested in building a Rohan deck. It just seems like there's so much synergy with not only character cards leaving play, re-entering play, but also these mounts we're starting to see are just so incredibly useful, so incredibly powerful, so having additional actions is always fun. I definitely think that this deluxe expansion brings a lot of power into our card pool. I'm just dead curious to see at what cost it's going to come. So, in a lot of situations, like we mentioned early on in the video, I think it's absolutely trivial as to whether you end the game with 39 threat or 37 threat or 43 threat. So long as you don't end up hitting 50, a lot of these cards can get players into those positions of power so much faster than would otherwise happen, and I just really can't help but wonder if this is going to push certain player decks into absolute overdrive, potentially lead to some broken combos. I'm picturing an Outlands deck where instead of using your resources, you can use this somewhat intangible threat value to draw additional cards and get your most valuable allies even faster, trigger effects to get even more resources into play than you would normally have, and then maybe on the first turn you've already got that powerful Outlands synergy just going crazy. So I'm certainly excited about all of these cards. They're certainly very powerful. I just can't help but hope the developers have done a good job with balance, and that months from now we're not going to be looking back on this expansion in the same way that players looked back on the Steward's Fear, thinking that this is a crutch, or something to that effect. So, color me tentatively very excited. Of course, I've yet to play any of our Voice of Isengard scenarios, but I'm very much looking forward to it, and I'm very excited to see how this is supplemented by the Ringmaker cycle.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with most of your comments there. As my final note, I think the most disappointing card for me out of the set here would be Saruman. I'm just not so sure that I'm ever going to use him. Just a little too corner case, a little too niche. Certainly I see the value, like I mentioned in my comments on him. There's that 10 threat location from some of the Nightmare decks. That certainly would be something I want to get rid of. But in a general use situation, for being, sort of the leader of the 5 wizards and the most powerful of them all, I find his ability a little underwhelming. But with that said, I am anxiously looking forward to trying, just like you, so many of these other cards in the weeks and months to come.
Something kind of unique about this deluxe expansion is that it has so many cards included where players were kind of wondering not only if we would ever see them, or maybe when we would see them, but what form they would take, what their abilities would be. Certainly, I think Éomer makes sense. Grima certainly has an interesting ability. I think it does fit his character. Saruman was still a relatively enigmatic figure even throughout the Lord of the Rings, so he's certainly a powerful wizard. It's certainly a potentially powerful effect, but for the most part, I'll mirror your sentiments with him. I think in a solo game, maybe I'll bust out Saruman, especially if I'm not running tactics, or maybe only if I'm not running tactics, but he's interesting, so you can't go wrong with that 5 attack value, but everything else about him I'm a little bit underwhelmed. So, again, I'll just say I enjoy the majority of these cards. I'm sure some of them are only going to get better and better in time. Things like Power of Orthanc, Isengard Messenger, and the Orthanc Guard. So, I certainly don't want to write off any of these cards at this point, and I'm sure eventually we'll find pretty decent use for all of these. I think compared to Heirs of Numenor and Khazad-dûm, this is a pretty respectable allotment of cards. I remember being distinctly underwhelmed by Heirs of Numenor in particular. I think Dane Ironfoot was one of the only reasons I was really excited about Khazad-dûm, so I think so far as deluxe expansions go, these are probably our most powerful cards yet, and in my opinion, possibly the most compelling to actually put into a deck. But with that said, we might as well bring this video to a close. So as always, thank you all for checking out yet another installment in the LOTR LCG progression series. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel if you have not already done so. All of these cards are brand new. We just recently opened up our own Voice of Isengard boxes, so feel free to let us know in the comments below if you've thought of any creative uses for some of these cards that either we've missed or we haven't thought of, if your opinions differ than ours. Probably the most rewarding aspect of making this series is the community interaction, so we always love to hear from you guys. I certainly hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you again soon.